Hello. In this video, we will look at Chinese art. We will focus on two specific dynasties, the Yuan dynasty in the 13th and into the 14th century, and then the Ming dynasty from the 14th century to the 17th century. At the end, we'll take a quick look at contemporary Chinese art and culture that shows a specific response to some of the traditions of Chinese art from the time period that we're focusing on. Chinese art has a long history of focusing on the expressive content versus the traditional conservative techniques. Now, what that means is that expression or personal expression is important based upon the artist's desire to communicate visually through technique. Now, Chinese history is long and varied, depending upon which historians you read and believe. The Chinese claim that their culture is thousands and thousands of years old, that it predates any European cultures, which is unlikely, but that's their claim. They claim to have had a codified system of written language at least 2,000 years before it developed in Mesopotamia. And while many of those claims are difficult for us to substantiate, I think the important element for us is that they have a long history and tradition of their culture and civilization, and it reflects in their art. Their art and culture tends to be fairly conservative, or at least it did until the 13th and 14th century. And by that, what I mean is that their art tended to be to follow certain traditions. And those traditions in aesthetic played out in the use of line, in the use of a limited value range, a limited color palette in most two-dimensional works, and using traditional building techniques which didn't really differ greatly in terms of practice or construction than what we see in other cultures, but the style was significantly different, as we'll see. Now, to understand Chinese culture, we have to take a look at what China looked like during this time period, during the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. The Chinese capital of the period was Beijing, which they referred to as Jingxi, and you can see that it's in the extreme northeastern section of the country. Now, this relationship with its location and with the rest of China really kind of helps us to understand how Chinese art and culture works. China is a very big place. It's a very vast place. It's divided up into provinces, and these provinces had their own kind of cultural traditions that were basically variations on the theme established in the capital. The Emperor of China ruled from the capital, but also had traveled around to various other summer palaces, winter palaces, and the system of rule was based upon this vast network, logistical network of governors and provincial capitals that could communicate messages back to the capital and back to the emperor. Now, the reason why this is important is because I think it helps us to understand the relationship with the Chinese, with the Koreans, their northeastern neighbors, and the Japanese, the island neighbors across the Yellow Sea. It helps us also to understand that because China is such a vast place, that it's not going to have kind of a uniform culture. So when we talk about the traditions, we're basically focusing on the traditions that come out of the capital. Now, for the Chinese, their traditional temple form is known as a pagoda. Pagodas have a few uniform elements that you'll see in all pagodas, but beyond that, beyond those elements, the expression of those elements will vary greatly. How many, their size, their scale, their proportion, their use, all of that will vary based upon cultural differences and practices from region to region, and from even within regions, from building to building. So in this pagoda that you see, what we kind of focus on is the overall form is tall and slender, and you see the repetitive use of the octagonal roof forms to divide the overall tower structure into these segments that get ever so slightly smaller as you go up. And that's the use, one of those uniform elements that we'll see is the use of those repetitive roof lines. The roof is not a single roof line or a single pediment. It's always broken into various levels and layers. And that has to do with the idea of the most common practice, religious practice of Buddhism, that the goal of every good Buddhist is to achieve enlightenment. And how you do that is to head down a path towards enlightenment based upon personal discipline, based upon introspection and evaluating of one's self. And then there's also an element within that of a denial of the self. And so as you go through this process of perfecting the self and limiting the physical and focusing only on the spiritual, though there will be fewer and fewer. You'll get higher and higher towards that expression of perfection, but there'll be fewer and fewer who can attain it in society. And that's sort of the idea behind this pagoda, is that as you get higher, it gets smaller, and and there are fewer at that who can achieve that level. The other thing that we find that is pretty typical in Chinese architecture is their desire and willingness to control the viewer's relationship to the site, to control how the building relates to the objects, the natural objects around it. And will not necessarily just mimic those objects, but certainly create a narrative in the mind of the viewer that we see these relationships. So the form of the tower kind of is mimicked or is mimicking the form of the trees. These trees are very typical in the region, and so as such, it's important to the architect that the building doesn't seem out of touch with its setting, with the landscape that surrounds it and the place. Art is very much about the place in which it's made. For some artists and for some cultures, and for the Chinese, that's very much the case. Now, the more typical pagoda style is represented in what you see here. In this style of pagoda, again, you see the repetitive use of the tiered layering roof lines, but the difference with this pagoda is that it has that more traditional lowest level supported by piers, and the roof, the image of the roof that's created resembles a boat. And so the idea is that it looks like a boat floating on the water, supported by the piers, to kind of give that sense of a journey, boats representing journeys. Now, in typical Chinese pagoda architecture, shrine architecture, what we'll see is a lot of very functional, slightly less decorative, slightly less ornamented structures. Now, it doesn't mean that they didn't ornament. It's just a little less decorative than we might see, say, in Korea or Japan. The focus really is more on the raw materials, on the details, on the lines, the patterns, the symmetry. I mean, this building is absolutely symmetrical, and line and pattern are how that symmetry is accentuated and communicated. Now, early on in the Yuan dynasty, in painting, what we see is the idea of balance expressed in composition through the use of positive and negative space. So the artist allows for a certain amount of negative space, the area around and in between the lines and shapes that create the positives of the rocks and the trees. But it's also as much about the space in between, and the fact that that space is allowed to be empty to kind of communicate the idea that it's not a complete or finished work, and that's another expression, another way to express this idea of Buddhism of following a path and a journey towards enlightenment, and that it's not complete until you arrive at enlightenment. In Chinese tradition, in painting, what we see most often is ink painting on scroll. Now, scrolls could be made of silk, they could be made of paper, they could be made of a variety of different types of papers, actually. These scrolls were not intended necessarily to be rolled and stored the way we kind of think about scrolls. They were more intended to be hung from supports, usually backed with a panel or weighted in some way to keep them straight, and then hung on a wall or as part of a screen, perhaps. Now, all of the characters, the symbols, and the stamps that you see there, those relate to the artist. They relate to perhaps his trying to express, either through a narrative or a poem or some other element, what the painting is supposed to symbolize or represent. The stamps represent his family lineage, including himself. They also perhaps could represent the patron. And they are very much a part of the image. It's not, it's not a separate thing. I think that for these painters, these stamps, these markings, they were a way to communicate something in the painting that was as important perhaps as the lines, as the shapes, because it's kind of simplistic. The overall drawing style is, relatively simple: outline, contour line, very little value, very little expression of shade and shadow, just a brief suggestion at the base of things, and behind things. And I think that that's a big part of the idea. It's subtlety. It's not overwhelming the viewer with technique or overwhelming the viewer with a specific concept, other than, than perhaps allowing for interpretation that comes from or comes out of the viewer's response to what they're seeing. So you're supposed to meditate on what you're seeing, and think about perhaps what you see in the work, what it makes you think of, what it makes you feel, and then that's your response. Now, unlike what we might have seen developing in the pre-Renaissance through the Renaissance, which is what's happening in Europe at the same time, where there's a strong emphasis on modeling, light and dark, color as value, all these elements that we've come to know of as realism in painting. In China, what's happening is a use of line to create, and the repetitive mark making to create texture, to create value. Now, the difference for the Chinese can be found in the way that they see space. So there's a question that the viewer here has to kind of answer for themselves as they're seeing the rocks and mountains here. Is this one continuous area of space, plane of space? Are the trees closer to us than the mountains? And that's why, the scale issues there. And then, are those small things behind the trees, are those clouds? And as such, then that's a whole different interpretation. Or are those just small outcroppings of rock and vegetation in between the trees and the mountains? So I don't think that the artist intends to give a specific answer to this question as to the picture plane. I think it's less important to them that we see this as a believable landscape, and more important that we understand it as trees and rocks and mountains, and to consider the natural, and to think about how the rendering it matches what we see in nature, and what those spaces and places, those natural places, how do they relate to this journey of man and civilization? Because that's ultimately what Chinese art and painting focuses on, is the man's relationship with the natural. So during the 14th century, Chinese art and culture was going through a more traditional phase, kind of a look towards the past for the path to the future. And so as such, these painters were really focusing on the most fundamental and traditional Chinese painting techniques of mark making, of line making, of using that positive and negative space that I was talking about. So we get a real efficiency of line. It's an abstraction, really, because we do see the subject matter in nature, but it's not an attempt to recreate that naturalistically in a way that is going to match what you might see in the real world. So, it is stylized, it is simplified, which is the definition of abstraction. Now, in terms of sculpture, the Chinese have a long tradition of casting either in clay, or, which is what you see here, or terracotta or bronze. They don't do as much marble carving as some other Asian cultures, but the sculptures that we see focus on realism in form in particular, to get forms in proportion, to get forms to scale. And then, of course, like most human cultures in art, what we tend to focus on is images, depictions of the human form in some way or another. So here we have a Chinese version of the Buddha. And we can see that from a couple of things. First, the pose and posture, the gesture, is very typical Chinese. He's missing his left hand, which would have been posed most likely, most commonly in a mudra, a hand gesture of the Buddha that represented peace and enlightenment. And then the right hand kind of gesturing, reaching towards the ground to represent that connection to the earth. The narrowed eyes to represent kind of the meditative state. The slight demure smile. It's not a full smile. It's not a, it's not completely neutral face. to represent contentment. And then in this case, the Buddha is depicted as Chinese, which the Chinese knew, and we know that he wasn't, that he was Indian, but they have embraced it. And in that tradition of, that's not necessarily about realism, it's really more about the message that's communicated. They, make Buddha look Chinese so that the Chinese people will relate more completely to him. He is dressed as a nobleman because they knew that the Buddha was a Chinese or an Indian prince, and so he's dressed as a nobleman from China would be, with all the kind of regalia that comes with, and his hair in that very formal bun that the men wore. Now, an object like this, a sculpture like this, would have been used as a symbolic reference. They don't worship Buddha as much as they do see him as a person to follow and emulate. And so sculptures like these were more for the people and practitioners of Buddhism to see and relate to Buddha as a leader. Now, like we talked about with Southeast Asia, this blue on white porcelain is common in many Asian cultures, most notably Southeast Asia. We see it in Vietnamese, we see it a little bit in Thailand, we see it heavily in China and Korea. Porcelain and stoneware work in Japan is very different. They did not embrace the blue on white in the same way that we see it in China. The Chinese are they may not necessarily be the inventors of this process. They are definitely the most influential practitioners of it. Chinese porcelain is known throughout the world, even today, hundreds of years later, as being some of the finest, both technically and stylistically available. In fact, the reason why we call porcelain, flatware, and dinnerware, and plates and bowls, we call that China, because most of it came initially from China. They exported it during this time period, from the 14th century throughout today. We still get exported porcelainware from China all over the world. It's one of their great cultural exports. Now, there were traditions in porcelainware. They decorated the porcelainware in registers, in those bands that you see, and that was very typical. You see a lot of vegetative pattern and design, a lot of symmetry, a lot of line work and value. You see the use of the natural, of course, things like the roses and the grasses and vegetation that you see there, of course the fish. But you also, in Chinese porcelainware, you have a desire to use the intricacy of the rendering. So these lines are very, very tiny, and that's really how they're showing off the quality of their technique, is to get the lines finer and finer and finer. And so the greatest decorators and painters of these porcelain pieces would show off the level of their skill by not necessarily in the intricacy of their designs. The designs themselves were repeated over and over. They didn't make each individual piece separate. There were patterns, and that's where the idea of a China pattern comes from, is that these were repeated over and over and over, and these traditions became important in the way that they express themselves through these objects. Now, this is one of a pair of vases that show off this decorative technique of the blue on white, and again in the bands and the registers, some of the same patterns, some of the same designs that we saw in the bowl, we see in the vase here. The big difference here, of course, is the use of cast and molded objects for the handles, the elephant heads for the handles, and then of course the the imagery of the dragon that wraps all the way around. And those dragons became really popular symbolically. The dragons were a symbol of China. They were kind of the fantastic top of the food chain. They didn't necessarily believe that they were real beings, that they were more spiritual beings, but they did believe in the power of symbols very strongly. And they matched these symbols with rank. And we see that come through, especially in the Ming Dynasty that we'll look at next. We'll see rank is incredibly important because the society gets larger and larger and more complicated and political and gets divided by rank. And so an object like this would have been placed, used decoratively and functionally to display flowers and in a palace, perhaps, or a temple. And these were really, really common pieces. Not that they weren't important, but they made multiples of these. They made molds, they cast and recast the vases over and over and again, and almost always the decorative techniques were the same. Now, as we move into the Ming Dynasty, there's going to be a couple of important changes. China, the emperors in the Ming Dynasty consolidate authority and power in Beijing, and they build the Forbidden City. Not that there weren't palaces there already, but the idea is that to try and take Chinese culture and preserve it and protect it through the separation of the classes. And we see that importantly expressed culturally through the Forbidden City most specifically. The Forbidden City is a complex of buildings surrounded by high walls and towers and even a moat to separate the emperor and his court from the city, the vast and growing city, even in the 15th, 16th century, around it. It was to keep, as much to keep the illusions of Chinese culture, to keep the grandeur, to make the emperor seem more special and important, perhaps. Not that he wasn't, he was, but that kind of propagandist message that anything that we deem important and we deem special, we keep it separate. So this is the great courtyard outside the High Palace in the Forbidden City. And during certain celebrations, only certain individuals would be allowed in of certain ranks. And for celebrations, for festivals, only a few foreign visitors were allowed, and they may or may not actually ever get an audience with the emperor. They're on the grounds of the Forbidden City, outside of the palaces. There are 7 palaces, by the way. There are many small shrines that are really there as just sort of a show of beauty and opulence of the emperor. Now, this picture gives you sort of a view of the scale of this structure. This is the courtyard area with focusing on the main palace, and then of course all of the layered tiers of terracing up to the palace itself. And the effect is to kind of create or to overwhelm the viewer with breadth and scale rather than with complexity of design. The building itself is relatively simple. I mean, it's built very similarly in those traditional techniques, post and lintel architecture, mostly wood and plaster, clay tile roof, built in that very traditional sweeping roof line from a straight central beam. There's very little about the structure that is overly complicated from a design sense. How it's trying to impress is the richness of the details and the overall scale. It's massive in breadth. Now, the walls and towers that surround the city and the moat that separate the walls and towers in the city from the rest of the city play an important role, just as important of a role. One, just from a security and practical standpoint, the idea of keeping the emperor, who is this figurehead, godhead, separate from all possible attack by foreign or domestic terrorists was very important. Because the only way to dethrone the emperor is to assassinate him. So it's important for the emperor to remain safe. But beyond that, they revered the emperor. This was not just a political post. This was a true universal leader. He was the spiritual leader. He was, of course, the social and political and military leader. But the emperor was revered all throughout China, and so treated as such. The diagram on the right gives you kind of a sense of the scale of the Forbidden City. The blue is, of course, the moat surrounding by the walls. There's only 4 gates, 4 entries in. All of the small little gray structures are buildings surrounding the main courtyard of the central palace. It's a really remarkable undertaking, and within the city there are a few very special places, and most of those have to do, of course, with the emperor and his showing off his grandeur and his power and his authority and his wealth to his own people, but also to outsiders. What you're seeing on the left is one of his many thrones in the Forbidden City, where he might, if he so chose, receive visitors or communicate with his advisors. And, I think it's important that what we understand about Chinese culture is that it's very orderly. It's very organized. And there are expectations, at least during this time period, there's expectations of personal expression, of the way, there's a right and a wrong way to do things. And once that's established, the going against that tradition is very difficult. It's also a very symbolic culture. China is proud, and in the region they felt like that they were the most important culture, very influential on both their neighbors and outsiders, most notably on Korea. China has a long history of kind of colonization in Korea, and then an adversarial relationship with Japan. So symbolically here, these lions, these are Chinese lions, and they sit representing symbolically the country, representing China. And underneath the paw or talon, claw of the lion is the eagle, which was, of course, a symbol for Japan. And so they definitely were trying to send the message that they were, kind of the leaders regionally, and for them that was globally. So it wasn't until China somewhat opens, or at least gets in some experience with the West, with Europeans in the 14th, 15th, and then well established by the 16th century, where China tries to kind of hold on to its identity as Europeans, more and more Europeans come to take advantage of the Chinese traditions and Chinese resources, Chinese technologies, Chinese markets, basically, both for export and for import, to bring things out of China, to bring to Europe, and to bring things into China from Europe to sell. Now, these are cast in bronze. The one on the right is gilded. The one on the left is obviously not. And I think this shows their skill in carving, but they're still very stylized, very abstract, very very uniquely styled. Now, painting from the Ming Dynasty takes the traditions that we see in the Yuan and not necessarily denies those or goes in a different direction, but more importantly, elaborates, basically makes them a little bit more complicated, a little bit more intricate. We see a stronger sense of the surface of the painting. We see the design becomes more complicated. They're not as meditative or simplistic. They're very textural, these paintings. The square on the right is an enlargement of the central section of the painting on the left. And these paintings are very unique because paintings like these that show landscapes, but they're kind of fantastic or stylized landscapes. They're not, they work with elements that seem real, but they're clearly not based on or goal to create reality. Texture, shape, stylization, personal kind of expression of what is beautiful, of what is of the use of line and shape and color. All of those elements mark Ming Dynasty painting. Now, this is also a period of tremendous wealth and prosperity in China. The emperor of China in the Ming Dynasty, the succession of emperors were some of the wealthiest people on earth. And they expressed that culturally in the same way that every culture does, by wanting to have the finest things and wanting to have the best of everything. So, these scrolls get more and more elaborate, they get more complicated, they get more aesthetic and more beautiful because the goal here is to try and show off the wealth of the emperor and the wealth of Chinese culture. This is an important kind of object. It's called a rank badge. These were actually worn on lanyards around the neck, and they would, the different figures in the badges would denote the wearer's rank. And so, like, if you were a member of the lion rank, then you would wear a badge like this. And you can just see how decorative, how patterned, how stylized the shape becomes really, really important in Chinese decorative art, in these badges, in painting, and of course in ceramics. So here we have a very traditional Ming vase. Ming vases, Ming porcelain is considered to be the finest examples of the technique and of the media in the history of China. Ming vases, Ming Dynasty porcelain is some of the most collectible. It's some of the most expensive and valuable. It's some of the most beautiful examples. This is not a large jar. It's a small storage jar for tea, perhaps. But the level of intricacy of the way that it's decorated and the incredible quality of the line and value work is really just stunning here. But overall, the form is very traditional, and the subject matter that's depicted, the lion heads and the dragons and the use of the petals, the flower petals around the base, all of that we've seen very traditionally in both Chinese and Southeast Asian porcelain. During the Ming, we see the addition in Chinese porcelain of more bright colors. These bright colors were a reflection of some stylistic changes and some taste changes during the period. Part of this has to do with the outside influence as foreigners, most notably from France and England, come to China and they see the quality of this porcelain ware, but they also know that the market is going to want more than just blue on white. So they encourage Chinese artists to add and augment different colors to the works to make them more marketable both in China and abroad. Now, over time, this practice of using a variety of colors will get perfected. Here, it's a little rudimentary. We don't see the fine work with the color that you would with just the simple blue on white. Now, the traditions and legacy of this time period in Chinese culture are still felt today. Chinese colonialism led to, and the Chinese, the rule of the Chinese emperors during the Ming led to an establishment in China of this divide between the rural and the urban, a divide between the very wealthy and the vast majority of the people who are poor. And ultimately, it's hundreds of years later, it's that divide that starts during the Ming that leads to the collapse of the Chinese imperial system and in the 20th century, and then ultimately the rise of the Chinese government that we see today. This is a work that was created in the 1960s. This is just a few of the figures from that work. It was called Rent Collection Courtyard. And it was, even though it was made in the 60s, it was used as its subject matter a scene, a typical scene from the Ming Dynasty. And that the way that the nobles made their money was by charging rent to the people that lived on their land. It was typical feudalism. But the works of this sculptural group, this wasn't made by just one person, but the leader of the group was Ye Yushen, who was a teacher and a leader in the school of sculpture in Sichuan, where this was first made. And the idea here was to express sort of the traditions of China and to bring out those traditions and to put them on display so that we would know, that no matter how far China goes and changes and moves into the 20th and now the 21st century, that the traditional culture and the traditional the way individual approach to exploring and depicting culture are very much a part still of China. There are more than 100 figures in this group. They were made from clay and cast and fired, and what we see in these figures is the plight ultimately of the people, of the rural, poor people from this region, and juxtaposing that and contrasting that with the few, the nobility, and that rank and class system that was so ingrained in Chinese culture. Now today, just in the last 20 years, architecture in China has radically changed. Some of the most dynamic architecture happening on the planet, some of the oddest architecture, some of the most interesting buildings being built are being built in China, and most specifically, and this is actually not just in the last 20 years, but it's really kind of exploded in that time period. But the city of Hong Kong, which was the last vestige of colonialism that was turned over to China back from Great Britain, continues, even though China was no longer connected to Great Britain. Hong Kong, they had a lease that lasted till 1999. The British did, and the Chinese honored it. But Hong Kong as a city is sort of Chinese, but not Chinese. And that's allowed for the architects within those cities. This is like Hong Kong and Shanghai and some of the other major urban centers and centers of industry and banking in the last 20, 25 years, to really embrace what is not, even though the style may not be traditional, but the practice of making things that are stylistically individualistic and stylistically daring, that is ultimately Chinese. And then when the Chinese hosted the Olympics, it was a big deal, and they wanted to show off to the world that they were not this backward kind of nation stuck behind, that they were forging ahead, and that they were actually creating their own trends and stylistic techniques. And some of these buildings are just amazing, but they still have that Chinese sensibility of the environment, of grand gesture, of space, of form, of using reflection, using water, using not overly complicated techniques, but just using them in a way that is very expressive. So Chinese culture, I think what's important for us to remember is that they saw themselves as the dominant cultural force in the region, specifically the region of Southeast Asia, with them, Korea and Japan. And the Japanese, they saw themselves as the dominant cultural force. So we'll see the clashing between the two. And that actually spills over into some battles and wars fought and continuing to be fought between the Chinese and the Japanese. But we'll talk a little bit more about that on the lecture on Japanese culture in a video to come soon.